I'm J. Lenora Bressler, and welcome to today's version of the Bible Delight in the Details. This is April the, 9th, I think? And I'm J. Lenora Bressler. I want to share with you something that I taught in my Sunday school class yesterday, and it comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. The first 16 verses of that chapter are very confusing and somewhat controversial because Paul is talking to the church at Corinth about hairstyles, actually. And he's telling the men that they are not to worship with their hair covered. Their hair is to be uncovered, and the women's is to be covered. And there's a lot of discussion about authority and who's under whose authority and all. And, it can get very, very confusing. Now, a lot of times when people read something like this, they simply say, well, that must have something to do with the culture of the time. And indeed, it did. But we pass over it too lightly. And we say, well, that was that then, this is now, that's not relevant. And so we just act as if it's not even in the Bible. And I think that that is definitely wrong. A lot of things about culture have gone by the wayside. But the things that God allowed to stay in the Bible and be perpetuated in the biblical scriptures must have a significance, a deeper spiritual or wisdom reason for being there than just of passing curiosity to somebody who's involved in archaeology. So I want to talk about something that I researched. I did a lot of research on this because I found it very interesting. And here is what I found. In Corinth was kind of like the Las Vegas of its day, and it was extremely sexually laden, and it was at a crossroads, and it was kind of known almost, you would say, as a conference town today. A lot of people coming and going, and a lot of people doing things there that they might not have done back at home. It was also a very Romanized or Greek, Hellified, Hellenistic city. In other words, it was they like to think of themselves as being in the big town kind of thing. And one of the things that the Corinthians as a church were really struggling with, most of them were Greeks, they were Romans as opposed to being Jews. And one of the things that they were struggling with is divisions among themselves. In fact, if you were looking for a theme of 1 Corinthians, it's that the church should not be divided over silly squabbles and over status and over cliques. That's really what 1 Corinthians is all about. And this idea about the hairstyles, it turns out, has a lot to do with that. You see, in the Greek world, men, when they were exercising power of authority, such as they were acting as a magistrate, or more importantly here, if they were engaged as a priest in pagan worship, they were expected to cover their heads. We found a lot of sculptures and frescoes, particularly of Augustus, the emperor who was reigning at the time of Jesus' birth, where he was actually acting as a priest in a pagan worship ceremony. And he has taken his toga and pulled it up as a covering over his head as he offered sacrifice to the idol. Now, this is interesting because, first of all, given that the situation was everybody in Corinth, in the Corinthian church, were vying over status and cliques, it's interesting. In this way, no man who was officiating or who was involved in any way in the worship was to be calling attention to himself by putting a covering over his head that would have indicated that he was in charge or that he was in some way directing or were over the others. We are a family before God, and we are equal before God. And even those of us that love and appreciate our pastors and our priests, they are still people. They're still human beings, failing, foible human beings. And they do not have a higher, they're not closer to God necessarily than we are, the common people. The other interesting thing was that in the pagan rituals, when a priest actually put a sacrifice in front of a pagan god, his putting that sacrifice in front of the God was considered an actual act of righteousness. And so you could say that the priest was getting credit as part of the sacrifice for what he was doing. And we know that in the Christian faith, it's nothing to do with us. All of the righteousness is on Christ's side. So again, calling attention to oneself as the leader of that worship service would not have been consistent with the Christian faith. Now, similarly, women's hairstyles had a lot to say about status. In the Greek world, the way that you wore your hair spoke about your status in society, primarily your relationship with your husband. If your husband was very wealthy and a man of status, then so were you as his wife. And so your hair would be dressed appropriately to your station. Obviously, the higher up you were in society, or your husband was, the more elaborately decorated your hair would be. And we know that from frescoes and from archaeology that Roman and Greek women's hairstyles sometimes took hours for servants to prepare every single day. Now, for the women, they were told that they were not to have uncovered heads, but rather covered. And here again, it goes right along with the whole idea of 1 Corinthians. Worship is supposed to be about unity, not disunity, not emphasizing one person's status over another. Interestingly, in Corinth also, there was a particular kind of hairstyle that was identified with prostitutes. And perhaps also Paul was concerned about the ladies being taken to be maybe not the kind of women they really were. And finally, there's probably also just the kind of age-old human nature that beautiful women can be a distraction to men in any situation, including in the church. And so we just should not be calling attention to that aspect of ourselves when we're really there to worship as brothers and sisters, not as potential love interests to one another. So the idea is, when you are worshiping, don't let any status consciousness or any factious contentiousness disrupt the unity of the family of God. I'm J. Lenora Bressler. Visit me on the next edition of the Bible to lighten the details. Have a great day.